Hi everyone, I'm going to start reading you guys a new chapter book. I'm very excited because I've never read this chapter book to a kindergarten group before, so I'm excited to read this with you. Today we're going to start reading Peter Pan. Show me a connection if you have this book. Maybe you've read this book, maybe you've seen the movie. All right, the author, and it says on here, this is retold from the J.M. Barrie original. Let's go ahead and get started. We're going to start with chapter 1, Famous Last Words. All children grow up, except one. Wendy learned this when she was playing in the garden one day at the age of 2. She brought her mother a flower, and Mrs. Darling hugged her and said, "Oh, why can't you stay like this forever and ever?" Before that day, Wendy didn't realize she wouldn't stay the same. Wendy had 2 younger brothers, John and Michael. They were growing too. Mrs. Darling stayed home with the children, while Mr. Darling went to work in stocks. His stocks didn't always work for him, however, and so the family had to scrimp and save. They still had a nanny, of course, because all the other families in the neighborhood had one, and Mr. Darling cared very much about keeping up with the neighbors. But the Darlings were poor, and so their nanny was actually just a giant Newfoundland dog named Nana. There's a picture of her. Nana was an interesting nanny, to say the least. She didn't believe in all this new fandangled talk about germs. Sometimes she would lovingly lick the children right after she licked her own feet. Yeek! Mr. Darling was ashamed of Nana, and sometimes he was cold to her as a result. He shouldn't have been. She actually was quite a treasure. If the children wandered or dilly-daddled on their way to school, she would bump them with her big head and get them back on track. She never once forgot about John's soccer uniform, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth instead of a bone in case of rain. And it did rain quite often in England. All in all, the Darlings were a normal, happy English family until, that is, the arrival of a boy named Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling had never heard of Peter Pan until one day when she was tidying up her children's minds. Most good mothers do this after their children are asleep, as if minds are drawers and children's memories are underwear and socks that need to be neatly folded and put away. Oh, how Mrs. Darling would wrinkle her forehead sometimes at the sweet things she found in her children's minds, wondering where on the earth they had picked them up. These things she would lay out and lovingly smooth on the bed for the children to slip on first thing in the morning. Other times, however, she found them mean or ugly thoughts in her children's sleepy heads. These she would shake out and quickly hide like something pushed under the bed. Children's minds are a curious place. If someone could draw a map, it would be full of zigzag lines and squiggles. Eventually, however, all the lines and squiggles would lead to Neverland. What is Neverland, you ask? It is the magical island in the middle of every child's mind. It is a place where children go to mainly in their imaginations, useless, of course, unless, of course, they have an invitation and a very special guide. Every child's Neverland is slightly different. Some are in color and others are in black and white. Some have ragged coral reefs with tiny smashed up boats, lonely caves, and tiny huts on the beach. Others have hunchback little old ladies, turtles laying eggs, or gnomes who like to sew. Others still have scary first days at school, trying not to laugh at church, pop quizzes on grammar that you haven't studied for, money from the tooth fairy, and chocolate pudding. There are no rules to what one's Neverland should be. John's Neverland had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, while Michael, who tried hard to be like his older brother, had a flamingo with lagoons flying over it. Wendy, meanwhile, had a pet wolf and a boat. The island doesn't appear on any map because it never stands still. If you can find it, Neverland is a very fun place to visit during the day when it's sunny. But in the 2 minutes before children go to bed, it becomes scary and full of shadows. That is why nightlights were invented. Do any of you guys sleep with a nightlight? I like to sleep sometimes with a nightlight too. Mrs. Darling didn't know anything about Neverland, or rather, she did from her own childhood, but she had long since forgotten and was so confused when she bumped into the island in her travels through her children's minds. There were other things that confused her too. For starters, there was the name Peter, which came up again and again in bolder letters than any other word in all of her children's minds, especially Wendy's. "Who is this Peter?" she asked her daughter. "Is he a friend of yours?" "Well," Wendy admitted, "not always." "You know I don't like you talking to strangers," Mrs. Darling said. "Oh, but he isn't a stranger, Mother. Don't you remember him?" "Why, I've never heard of him in my life," Mrs. Darling insisted. But as soon as she had said this, she knew it was not quite true. She could not remember meeting Peter or ever knowing him. No, she was too old for that. But in the back of her mind, she recalled a story about a boy who kept children company so that they would not be scared. She was sure that she believed in him when she was Wendy's age. "Well, anyway, even if I did remember him, by now he would be all grown up, just like me," she said, and she tucked Wendy in for the night. "I'm worried about this Peter person," Mrs. Darling told her husband later that evening. "Don't be," he said. "It's probably just some nonsense put into their heads by that no-good nanny. It'll all blow over. Just wait and see." For these are what sometimes referred to as famous last words. Okay, friends, that is the end of chapter 1. I'm going to continue reading chapter 2. "Now, Peter, now." Children often find the strangest events rather commonplace. For example, they might casually mention that when they were playing in the woods last Wednesday, they met a ghost and played tag with him on roller skates. It was in just this way that Wendy revealed something quite upsetting to her mother one morning. Mrs. Darling was tidying up the nursery where all of the young Darling children slept and discovered some leaves on the floor. She asked Wendy about them, but Wendy merely replied, "Oh, Peter must have left those leaves." "What do you mean?" said Mrs. Darling, asking nervously. "Well, he really is quite messy," said Wendy, who was a very tidy child. With a sigh, she explained that Peter often came to the nursery at night and sat at the foot of her bed, playing the flute. "Sweetheart," Mrs. Darling assured her, "the front door's locked at night. No one can get in." "He comes in through the window," Wendy insisted. "He can't possibly. We are 3 stories up. Why didn't you tell me this before?" her mother cried. "Well, I got hungry and forgot," said Wendy, who was now feeling rather hungry again. While Wendy went to look for a snack, Mrs. Darling stayed behind, still frowning about the leaves. The thing that scared her most was that she was fairly certain they were from a tree that did not even grow in England. She searched the room for other clues, but she found none. "You're making a fuss out of nothing at all," Mr. Darling insisted when she told him. "Now, come to bed." "Oh, I suppose you're right," Mrs. Darling said. Only he wasn't. The very next night she tucked the children in and went downstairs to sit by the warm fire and sew and fell asleep. Almost immediately she started to dream. She dreamed that Neverland had drifted too close to the beach and that a strange boy had jumped into the water and was swimming toward her children. Wendy, John, and Michael were on the shore, happily waving him in. This might have only been a silly dream were it not for the fact that upstairs the window of the children's bedroom had blown open and a boy really had flown in and dropped onto the floor. With him was a little light, no bigger than a fist, that darted around the room like a mosquito. Now, does anybody happen to have a guess who this next character might be? Oh, some of you guys are telling me who you think the next character in our story might be. Let's see if you are right. Mrs. Darling woke with a start. She knew at once that the swimming boy was Peter Pan. She ran upstairs, she threw open the door to the children's bedroom, and sure enough, there he was. He was wearing clothes made of leaves, the same strange kind that he had left behind the last time. But the strangest thing about him was that although he must have been very old by now, at least as old as she was, he still seemed to have all of his baby teeth. When Peter saw Mrs. Darling, he bared those pearly white teeth at her and he growled. Mrs. Darling screamed, and in a split second, Nana was there. She growled too and lunged at Peter. He dodged her and he jumped out the window. Mrs. Darling screamed again. After all, she didn't want the boy dead. She looked down and saw no broken body. Looking up, she saw what looked like a shooting star speeding away. Then she turned. She saw that Nana had something in her mouth. It was Peter's shadow. Nana had nipped it with her teeth right before Peter jumped, and the shadow had snapped off. Nana wanted to hang the shadow out the window so Peter could come back and get it without bothering the children. But Mrs. Darling thought it would look like laundry drying. Mr. Darling would be upset if the neighbors saw that. Instead, she decided to stuff the shadow into the bottom of a drawer, hidden away like one of her children's unpleasant thoughts. "That horrid dog," Mr. Darling said when she told him about what had happened the next day. "She can't go around snapping off people's shadows left and right. Why, we'll be sued." Poor Nana, and poor Mr. Darling, too. He knew he was being awful and unfair, but he couldn't help it. He was frustrated and jealous about other people doing better in the stock market and about the children loving Nana so very much, possibly more than him. It didn't help matters that Nana had brushed up against him yesterday, getting white hair all over his coat. "Go to the doghouse where you belong," he yelled at her. "George," Mrs. Darling whispered, "remember what I told you about that boy. What if he comes back and Nana's not here to guard the children?" But Mr. Darling would not listen. He was determined to show everyone who was the master of the house, and so out went Nana. That night, as Mrs. Darling was putting the children to bed and lighting their night lights, they heard Nana downstairs in the yard barking. "She is just protesting about being chained up," John said. Wendy was wiser, however. No, that is how Nana barks when she smells danger, she said. Mrs. Darling shuddered. Outside, she saw 1,000,000 stars, some of which seemed to her to be hovering around the house as if they were trying to get in. Oh, how she had wished that she and Mr. Darling did not have to go to a dinner party tonight. Don't worry, Mama, Michael said. Nothing can hurt us when our night lights are lit. Isn't that right? And this was something Mrs. Darling had told the children in the past, so she couldn't very well take it back now. That's right, she said very smoothingly. Night lighters are the eyes as mother leaves behind at night to watch over their babes. Besides, she told herself, she and Mr. Darling would be so close, only a few houses away. What could possibly happen? A few minutes later, Mr. and Mrs. Darling were outside, strolling arm in arm to their dinner party, but they were being observed from above. It was the stars, and they were spying. The old stars were glassy-eyed and bored, but the little ones were curious and full of wonder and winks. They didn't particularly care for Peter, who liked to sneak up behind them and try to blow them out, but they were generally fond of fun, and Peter was all about fun, so they decided to help him tonight. The instant Mr. and Mrs. Darling were safely inside the neighbor's house, a commotion broke out in the heavens, and a chorus of the smallest stars in the Milky Way cried out, "Now, Peter, now!" Okay, friends, that is the end of chapter 2. We will read chapter 3 tomorrow, and it is called Acorn Kisses and Jealous Fairies. I hope you guys all have a great day. I'll see you guys later. Bye.